The Rotting Magician by Apollinaire was a book about Merlin, and it was originally supposed to be illustrated by Picasso and was Henry Kahnweiler's first publishing venture. Henry Kahnweiler, as you might remember, was one of the first portraits done by Picasso in his Cubist style. Derain illustrated Apollinaire's book with 32 woodcuts. These have stark contrast between the whites of the paper and the black inks. Heavy outlines and flat shapes characterize these woodcuts. They evoke but do not explicate the text. The collaboration with Derain and Kahnweiler inserts Apollinaire into the period of both Fauvism and Cubism. Apollinaire is very closely associated with Orphism, which of course is a term that he coined. He was both a poet and a critic. And Orphism relates to the symbolist obsession with the Greek myth of Orpheus, who was the ideal because he was a symbol of both the poet and the artist and those coming in concert, which is part of that idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk again. In the collaboration, the Orphist collaboration of Blaise Cendrars and Sonia Delaunay, what we see is this really incredible Gesamtkunstwerk. On the right, you have Cendrars' free verse text of impressions while riding the Trans-Siberian Railway. What he tries to do with the way he structures text is to achieve motion in verse. The watercolors that are provided by Delaunay do not illustrate the narrative or the scenes, but instead evoke mood. They rely on the simultaneous contrast of color and the interaction with the text to also try to achieve a parallel motion with what Cendrars was doing with his verbiage. The illustrations, in fact, spill into the text. This was intended to be a print run of 150 copies, which, if laid end to end, would have reached the height of the Eiffel Tower. However, only 60 editions were ever printed. This is a true example of a Gesamtkunstwerk. Cendrars' own publishing house was responsible for its bringing it out. And it reads, interestingly enough, like a scroll, so it employs other modes of book production and reading than the codex and provides a more fluid, again, a more motion-filled experience. In addition to his role as a founder of Orphism, probably more important for the history of the illustrated book was Apollinaire's role as a pioneer in the use of typeface and the arrangement of words to make calligrams. In the examples here, we have number 1, countryside, and the French text tells us that this is a house where the stars and the gods are born, arranged in a shape of a house, and then on the side, a lit cigar who smokes. In the second example, It Rains is the title of the poem, and the first line on the left reads, "It rains the voice of women as if they were dead, even in memory." For German Expressionists, the idea of collaboration and interaction of the arts implied by Gesamtkunstwerk was absolutely central to their practice. One of the most important of the German Expressionist artists for the illustrated book is Oskar Kokoschka, and from him we have an introduction from the Vienna Secession where he first had worked. He, like the other Expressionists, experimented in a lot of print media and without training. Therefore, the quality often varied. Woodcut was, for instance, one of the favored mediums, but it was a raw grain and the broad areas of color rather than the finesse of technique that was employed by the graphic artists. One of the appealing aspects of print, and especially of woodcut, was the notions of authenticity and handcraft, a direct relationship between the artist and material. Many of the paintings of this period have bold markings in black and white that are easily translated into the medium. And the idea of the woodcut was very closely associated with primitivism. In Kokoschka's seminal work, The Murderer, Hope of Women, from 1916, we have an example that is characteristic of much of his book production, which is that the illustration does not submit to the writer's word. Rather, they have an expressive response to the text. It is not illustration in the sense that he explained or decorated the text with images. Rather, he presented an idiosyncratic version. In Murderer, he is both the author and the illustrator. The language is less of a narrative. It is illogical and filled with Freudian ponderings common to his period. He punctuates the text with exclamations, cries, obscenities, incomplete thoughts. He transposes private emotions to a public production form, which is an aspect of Expressionism. He illustrated the book with 5-line block reproductions after ink drawings made with pen, 4 with brushed gouache editions. These drawings were executed in 1910. Publication was separate by Herwarth Walden's Verlag der Sturm. The plates were completed by 1910. This also led to a play, like we saw with Oscar Wilde, which was performed in 1909 before the plates were even totally completed in Vienna. According to Museum of Modern Art's descriptions, quote, "These illustrations emphasize the violent interactions between the two central figures whose nude bodies are covered in expressive net-like patterns of tattoos, at the time signifiers of primitivism, criminality, and degeneracy." Kokoschka also produced performances in Dresden much later, in 1917. And this led to a series of The Murderer led to a series of literary works that continue until the end of World War I in 1918. His later works shift in the drawing style from ink, which was the basis for these works, to chalk on transfer paper and a more painterly tone. The Expressionist book production was critical from bibliophiles. Many felt that the German Expressionists disregarded the unity of the page and therefore the cohesiveness of the book. And it's probably not surprising that we don't have many of these as examples in our SCRC. The artist Ernst Barnlach is another important illustrator with Expressionist ties, but who moves in quite a different direction. His Die Steppenfahrt was first published in Kunst und Künstler, a periodical associated with Cassirer and the Berlin Secession. He obviously was not involved in the layout of this magazine, but it demonstrates him playing with an illustration style that links him to Käthe Kollwitz and the German Expressionist with whom he had some significant ties. More importantly is Der Kopf, which was published as both a popular edition of 1,000 and a deluxe edition with original woodcuts in an edition of 210, plus 20 Supreme deluxe edition that had a supplementary suite of prints. In this collaboration, Paul Cassirer, who is very important for the advent of German modernism, and his Pan Press demonstrate that, like Kahnweiler, there is also another intermediary in the financier and the publisher in this illustrated book market as it transitions into modernity. Rudolf Koch is also important in this, and the Klingspor Foundry, which were innovators in type design. The one that was used by Barlach in Der Kopf is one that shows the transition of Koch from really experimental modernist types to a highly nationalist German font that he would prefer after 1920. The illustrations are quite expressionist in their tone and line, But the book layout is more reflective of considerations than Kokoschka's, and the relationship of text to void more expected. Um, and illustration is definitely subservient to and related to text. So overall, it is a much more conservative publication.